Welcome, everybody. I want to welcome you to this kickoff event of Fifth Avenue's 45th anniversary year. It's lots of things going on with the 45th anniversary, including a community bus tour that's scheduled for October 17th from 9:30 to 1 p.m. But we're here today to have this amazing panel of august leaders of Fifth Avenue. It's dating back to its earliest days. Some quick housekeeping. We will be doing a Q&A session as part of the panel. Those of you dialing in from Zoom, you'll see a Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. Please feel free to load up questions in the Q&A, and we will get to them towards the end. I am really thrilled to be a part of this celebration of Fifth Avenue Committee. My name is Sam Marks. I'm on the board of Fifth Avenue Committee. And I have personally like a nearly 20-year relationship with this organization. First, in my early part of my career as a fellow practitioner when I worked at the Bronx at Wedco, then as a philanthropic funder when I was at Deutsche Bank, and then at LISC, I was a funder and a lender and a partner in many ways, and now I'm a board member. And in my nearly 20-year relationship with FAC, I've really only known it in its current iteration as this robust, strong, scaled organization under the leadership of Michel Delaouz. And in prepping for this panel, it has been really a thrill to listen to some of those stories of the early days. 45 years is a big chunk of time. It is a lifetime for some people. It's a major chunk of my life. And over that course of time, you can really hear about different iterations of this organization. Welcome, Brad. So I'm excited to share these stories with you in my role as moderator. So I've asked our panelists to sit kind of in chronological order, and I was tempted to kind of go in chronological order, but I think it might be more interesting to do a snapshot of FAC 45 years ago and FAC today, and then we'll sort of go back and fill in the details. So I would like to start with Pat Conway. Pat, you are one of the founding mothers of Fifth Avenue Committee. And I would like to invite you to give us the origin story of FAC and start with what were the presenting problems in Park Slope, in Brooklyn, in the city that Fifth Avenue Committee was built to address?
Okay, it's hard to condense so many years into just a few minutes, but I've made some notes to try to keep myself reined in. The founders of FAC, I would start with, had the insight to bring together both residents and business owners from the entire 2-mile-long Fifth Avenue corridor, from Flatbush Avenue on the north to 26th Street, which is the cemetery boundary on the south. And the very first meetings revealed that although the particulars varied from place to place, that everyone recognized and was concerned about some very broad issues. The first one was the general disinvestment by both the public and the private sector in our section of Brooklyn. At the north end, it was obvious in the form of vacant storefronts and the huge garbage dump that became known as the Baltic Street lot. Further south, the city was promoting a private development of a huge 24-hour supermarket on an old industrial site next to the BQE, west of 3rd Avenue. Some of you might remember that there was a pathmark there for a while. Well, the city was doing this without including small business owners or on nearby Fifth Avenue in the planning for the site or even including them in the conversation. They were very concerned about their own businesses and how they were going to be affected by this big development of a mall, which is the way it was talked about at the time. In the meantime, the city was withdrawing services from the area, noticeably reducing sanitation services and allowing landlords to get away with bleeding their buildings by collecting rents without maintaining the buildings or providing the required services to tenants. Then there was a second set of issues really related to the first. And they were under the general category of redlining. And the stalled urban renewal projects that were nearby. This was before the days of the CRA, which some of you know about now, the Community Investment Act. It didn't exist at the time. Moderate income people, especially Black and Puerto Rican people who had lived in the neighborhood and really made it a neighborhood, had a hard time getting mortgages and other banking services. So that was a big problem. One of the early strategies that we used was to always combine meetings and policy proposals with actions. The idea was to build our own motivation and sense of empowerment while we worked toward the goals. And I'll just give a couple of brief examples and then give someone else a chance. One of the things that we did pretty early on was rally neighborhood people to support the creation of a tenant-owned limited equity co-op out of what was a failed development of federally financed and rehabbed townhouses on St. John's between 5th and 6th. Some of you might know those buildings now. You can imagine dozens of neighborhood people packing the room where a community board meeting to discuss the plan was being held. The developer's idea was to evict all the tenants and sell the buildings. Board members were very surprised and impressed, I have to say, to see such a large and diverse group, including homeowners and business people, there to support low-income and working-class tenants. It was a very long process, took, I think, almost 10 years, but ultimately it was successful. I'm happy to report, and the co-op is still active and still a limited equity co-op today.
Amazing.
Very exciting.
So could I ask you to just briefly sketch out for us, what did the Fifth Avenue Committee as an organization look like in year one? How many staff? Like, what was the level of formality of back in year one?
Okay, in the very beginning, the volunteer board, which really ran the organization day to day, found a way through a local organization, the Good Shepherd Sisters, to be assigned 5 CETA workers. That's a program some of you, maybe most of you, have never heard of. CETA is Comprehensive Employment Training Act. It came out of that time when there were a lot of unemployed people, and the city and federal government weren't sure what to do with us all. So anyway, we were able to get 5 staff people, and one of our board members volunteered an empty storefront of his to open an office. So that was the very beginning. Fran Justa, who was the first president of the board, together with one of those CETA workers, got together and wrote a funding proposal, got the first real influx of cash into the organization, and hired the first executive director and myself as an organizer. And then we're able to keep on some of the CETA workers once their time in CETA ran out and made them actual employees. So we had like 5 people in a volunteer office or an unpaid office.
In kind.
Yeah.
So I'm going to skip Wendy and Brad for the moment. And just as a snapshot, take us forward 45 years, Michelle. Help us understand, before and after. Disinvestment was the problem we were solving for. It was a largely volunteer-led organization, very few staff. Give us a little bit of like the vital statistics of Fifth Avenue Committee today, just for contrast.
Sure. So So today, of course, it's Fifth Avenue Committee plus Brooklyn Workforce Innovations and Neighbors Helping Neighbors. Like when we think and talk about our work, it's really all three organizations working collectively to advance economic, social, and racial justice. The three organizations have a combined budget of over $19 million. And have over 155 staff. Fast forward, FAC has completed 1,300 units of affordable housing in over 150 buildings, many of them projects that Wendy and Brad worked on. We now own and or manage over 740 units of housing. Our affordable housing development pipeline includes 1,600 units of housing. And all of this means that we're stewarding on behalf of the community and people that we serve over $230 million worth of assets, community controlled assets. And that includes community facilities, it's affordable housing, and increasingly it's actually also solar. Like we're also stewarding solar assets on behalf of the community. So that's like the physical piece, right? I mean, obviously the work is also, with people and in community together. And the three organizations serve over 5,500 low and moderate income New Yorkers. And it's not just Brooklynites. I mean, obviously there's a big concentration of people that we serve still in the historic catchment area, like, Park Slope, Honest, that, there's certainly a high concentration here. But, we increasingly, we have big presence in Sunset Park. We have folks from the Bronx. We completed our first project in Jamaica, Queens. An affordable project in Queens is the first physical development that we do outside of the borough of Brooklyn. In our organizing work has, influenced and created local legislation like the Asthma-Free Homes Act. It's obviously influenced things like neighborhood rezonings. But we're also creating programs that are being replicated locally and even nationally. BWI's Made in New York TV and film training program. That's, other places around the country are looking to BWI about how to do it right. Hopefully the actors will get off strike soon. And our library project is being replicated.
Yeah. So Michelle, clear story here in terms of scale, ambition, community assets under ownership. As you hear Pat describe the presenting problems that was the origin story of FAC, give us what you heard in terms of what of Pat's problems are still problems today. What are the new problems? What is the sort of operating environment for FAC relative to its year one?
Well, I'm sorry to say that we haven't solved a systemic racism that I think is the presenting problem that was, New York City is still a highly segregated city. It's obviously the most segregated large city in the country. And the impacts of redlining and like failed urban renewal efforts can still be felt. It kind of like takes different forms today, right? I mean, the digital divide is a form of redlining. The fact that we have asthma rates that are higher or mortality rates that are higher in, communities of color. Those are forms of redlining. The fact that we're talking about, fixing the BQE rather than knocking it down and like giving that land back to the community for open space and affordable housing, and like thinking about it as really an example of environmental racism and like how do we rectify that? Like those are all things that we kind of are engaged. These are conversations that FAC is to this day engaged in and helping lead. So that's the context today is one where we are really focused on addressing inequality, where we're trying to tap down speculation, where we are organizing in buildings where there's predatory equity investment that increases gentrification and displacement pressure. So some of the same things that existed before People are still being harassed, and things like that. Scams are still happening. People are still being targeted. So, a lot of what we do is organizing and advocacy. And of course, the human capital investment, the aspect of our work that like directly invests in people, either through education or job training or, financial coaching. All of that is a really significant aspect of what we do now.
I'm sure there's much more of the story to tell about FACT today, but I do want to try to connect the dots between year 1 and year 45. So let me invite Wendy Fleischer to talk a little bit about her stewardship of Fifth Avenue Committee and when you stepped in and what was the state of play when you came in as a 25-year-old? Is that right? Take it away.
Well, I was much more on this end of the spectrum. It was 1985 when I started. We were still in that little storefront office that John Toohey had rented us. We had no actual flooring. We had plywood floors and the bathroom door hung from the ceiling. We were about 5 people. And I was a little bit dismayed to learn after I started that we really didn't have enough money to make my salary of $14,500 a year. And there had already been a lot of accomplishments. FACT had organized block associations, come together, work together on that rubble-strewn lot that Pat mentioned on Baltic Street. And by the time I started in '85, that was mostly completed 3-family homes, 44 3-family homes. With a new supermarket, and my job partly was to run the lottery to fill those houses. We were paid $1,500 for each house that we occupied, which felt like a windfall to us, and was able to help kind of start to put in or make a reserve fund for our organization and stabilize us a little bit. As you heard from Pat, like that project took years to organize against the city, bring people together, get so many people together, build that housing. And in a lot of ways, it was a huge success story at the very early days of the community development movement. But we were also very unsophisticated in those days compared to now. And, we didn't have any control of who the developer would be. It was this guy, Julius Merberg from Queens. And you might notice the houses look like they could be in Queens. And at the time they opened, they had a lot of issues. And FACT was very strongly identified with that project, but we didn't have any control over quality or over design. But we, still, it was in many, many ways a big success. The neighborhood was way more diverse than it is now today. At that time, it was about a third, Latino, Black, and white. And it was a very, in some ways, a very special moment to have that. People really worked together. The community that I came into when I became director had a lot of deep connection in it. And it was a very moving and amazing experience to get to be part of that. I would work till all hours of the night, at 10 o'clock at night, rolling down the gate of that storefront office. And I felt even at a time when the crack epidemic was raging in New York, and New York wasn't nearly as safe as it is today, I felt kind of safe because we had people who would hang out on our stoop outside. They called me Flaquita, and they, would kind of be my friend and watch out for me a little bit. And it was just a very special moment in the history of the neighborhood. Our board president missed a meeting, and we found out later that she's actually killed in her home. The crime rate at that time was very high, and it was really drug related. So it was a time of real transition, from a New York that was very scary and unsafe, but also, I can't really underscore how much of a community of purpose it was, of people coming together to work together to make it better.
And Wendy, could you just give a minute on, it was under your tenure that FACT got into the housing business in terms of development. And can you just give a little bit of a flavor for what that looked like in its most early days?
Yeah, well, we had been involved in the housing business in the sense that we brought developers in and organized around getting these projects done. At the time, we had gotten 13 properties, I think, on Warren Street to renovate, and the last one was still not completed when I came on, and there was a guard dog living in it, nobody else, because people were stealing the copper out of the pipes in the building, and the developer had walked off the job before it was finished. So one of my first jobs was to get it, out of the workout section of the chemical bank, and into, back into production. We closed that, and then from there, it was a time at the community development movement when Mayor Cottonelli announced his plan in '85. The low-income housing tax credit came out in 1986, but it still wasn't really available. But the city and state put together these cookie cutter programs that even a 25-year-old idiot, who didn't know anything about housing development could figure out how to use. And so we started to do housing development. We did our first multifamily building also on Warren Street. Using, the New York State Housing Trust Fund had a grant program for pre-development, even for some development dollars. The city created the participation loan program and the 8A loan programs, which were very easy to use and straightforward. And I sat with my calculator and my green ledger paper and did 30 years of, figuring out how to get it done. But it was hard, but the projects got done, and there was a lot of support from the city and state at that time.
Awesome. So Brad, let's move on to you. I think it's fair to say under your tenure, Fifth Avenue Committee had a major growth spurt in scale and ambition, and just give us a flavor for the organization you inherited and what was going on.
So I started in February of 1993. Pat was one of the 3 executive committee board members who hired me. We were in an office, kind of one big room in the Park Slope Neighborhood Family Center on 14th Street. There were 7 staff, I think. Dahlia Lugo was one of them, our office manager. Kali Indoy, rest in peace, was the housing organizer and developer, and 5 other staff. And the first project Pat had done as developer, 571 Warren Street, had been completed. 2 more were underway. A 6-unit building focused on to be housing for homeless families at 76 Fifth Avenue, and another project with the State Office of Mental Health actually focused on folks coming with mental health issues on Warren Street. So it was still, and there was enough money in the bank to pay my $30,500 salary. So on the one hand, it was still a small organization, but it was really well poised in a lot of ways for growth. First, it was really clear in its values. I think by then, some of the early CDCs had kind of become just like developers and managers, and there was a lot of clarity in the organization. We want to be stewards of assets. We see this community changing and gentrifying. We know we need to get as much as we can kind of under community control. So we would like to do more development, but the organization is grounded as a place that organizes people, that builds community, and we don't want to lose that. So that clarity was really strong. This insistence on building inclusive community. You could already see gentrification undermining that special diversity, and there was a commitment to be organizing to prevent displacement. A lot of that had already happened, and a real deep commitment to continuing it. But you could see even in those initial developments, very few CDCs had as 2 of their first 3 developments for homeless families and families with special needs. And there was just a real understanding, and that through line from the very beginning on to the Gowanus rezoning has just really been very, very clear. So we were able to kind of launch from there, do sort of our first big project as a developer, which was 6 vacant buildings on Fifth Avenue, kind of start doing more housing development. move into doing some more economic and workforce development. We re-upped the Vista grant, so we had some more staff to help. Started doing what became ultimately Brooklyn Workforce Innovations, and kept going on a lot of the organizing work, both for policy fighting, that was especially like trying to save and strengthen the rent laws that until 2019, every couple of years you had to fight for saving them again and strengthening them. And that was just so palpable here. You know, we had this campaign, a displacement free zone, to try to help with smaller buildings. And here we are still today fighting for good cause eviction protections, because people who don't have rent stabilization protections are just, you know, were just totally removed from this neighborhood by price escalation. And lots of other kinds of organizing as well.
Awesome. I wanted to ask about, so no one person at the head of an organization can embody all of the community that they're serving. And I wanted to ask each of you to reflect a little bit on, just from your own personal background, leading an organization that is focused on low-income communities and serving Black and brown folks primarily. How did you think about your role from whatever background you came from? And how did you think about sort of like the leadership development aspect of Fifth Avenue Committee from where you were coming from? Michelle, do you want to start on that one?
Sure, I can, sure. I'll just say that I'm very proud of the fact that I'm the first Latina to lead Fifth Avenue Committee, especially given the context of the community. Like when I first moved to New York City 33 years ago, you know, Lower Park Slope in Gowanus were majority Latino. But as someone who like grew up in a working class immigrant family, you know, whose father was an asylum seeker, whose, you know, mom was so poor at one point she was in an orphanage. Went to bilingual education, like all of those things, and brothers who had experiences with the criminal justice system and struggled with addiction. Like, I think all of those personal experiences and family experiences like are as important in my experience as a leader of this organization, given its mission and values, as the professional pieces, right? The social work, the public administration, you know, having worked for, you know, Media Velasquez, like I love being able to bring all of myself to this job. And which is one of the reasons why, like 19 and a half years later, I'm still here. Like, you know, the organization has grown, I have grown. And so I think it's a beautiful thing. And I feel like in my various roles in life, I've always been this bridge between community and power, whatever the power was. And the fact that that's a big part of what FAC does. Like FAC makes and supports local folks who have all kinds of answers to the problems that our communities are facing, right? They know what needs to get done in their buildings and their communities. They give input in how best to design our curriculum, whatever it is, they are really the experts. And our role as Fifth Avenue Committee is really to just support that development and to help people connect the dots between their individual experiences and the larger political and policy efforts and that are going on. And so for me, that's a big part. Like I help connect dots, the organization helps connect dots, that supports people to take on leadership roles. I mean, whether it's, you know, we have folks that started coming to our office seeking help, who are now in elected office. We have, you know, people, former executive directors in elected office. But there are a lot of leaders with small L who are like, you know, doing the things that Wendy touched on, like looking out for their neighbors, helping each other. You know, that certainly happened during COVID and continues to happen. Like that is a lot of what goes on to help like build that sense of community, that cohesiveness between people. And so I think that's a big part of what we do and part of our values.
It's great. Before we go on to the next person, I do want to just put a shout out to the folks on Zoom. start filling up the Q&A. We'll be doing Q&A shortly. But let some folks on the panel respond to that question. Who'd like to go next? Pat, you look like,
Yeah, I think that one of the things that I wanted to mention today was that the reasons that some of us are here is because the folks who kind of brought us into the whole thing to begin with are no longer around. So that I particularly would like to give a shout out to Fran Justa, who was our first president. Nino Nanaroni, who was actually our first executive director, who just died this summer. To Sarah Cromer,
Rebecca
Willie
Reich.
McDonald,
Yeah.
Rebecca Reich. And one of the things that I wanted to particularly mention was what was important to me. I was another one of those 20-something-year-olds who, when I came here, I had some training as an organizer, but it was working as an anti-war organizer against the Vietnam War. And when I arrived in this neighborhood, I met people who were strong union members. And they were some of the reason that we organized the way that we did. They knew about organizing. They understood and believed in the idea that people working together were going to accomplish more than somebody just making a complaint on their own. There also were very strong institutions, which unfortunately are not always as available these days. Some of the local religious organizations, the local Catholic parishes. I mentioned before the Sisters of the Good Shepherd, who ran a number of programs for young people, were very active in the area. And those institutions are not as strong these days as they were at that time. But I learned a lot from all of those people. And I really appreciated, as I have gone through not only my Fifth Avenue Committee related experience, but my life doing other work as well, that what had been a relatively insular growing up on Long Island for me became a much broader experience of life. And it was, I would go back to what Wendy said before, it was a particularly unusual time. And I was lucky enough to be part of it.
Yeah, same. I grew up in a mostly white neighborhood on Long Island. And this was like an incredible, meaningful experience for me, more than I even realized at the time, that how unusual it all was. I mean, that in some ways was an umbrella for all these different people doing incredible things. And they were so warm and welcoming to me. I mean, I was 25 years old, and most of the staff, and everybody else was older than me. And I'm sure some people resented that, and probably rightly so, and yet I didn't feel that. I can't tell you how many dinners I had at people's houses before board meetings, Annie Thompson sitting across from her Garden of Union, looking out the window at what she had made, there, cooking me pasta fagioli, and, sitting in Dorothy Quisenberry's house on Dean Street, and coming to Pat's house and meeting her children. And it was, Iban Muhammad on St. John's Place, like, John Duda, Camp Friendship, like there was all these efforts of people working for kids, working on community gardens, and yet there was this umbrella, that Fran had envisioned, that came to be the Fifth Avenue Committee. And it was a very special and beautiful thing. And I think I felt an enormous sense of responsibility taking over the organization as a young person, to kind of honor what had been created and to try to leave it in a little bit of a better place. Yeah.
Yeah, excuse me.
Or what?
That very deep commitment to we sometimes call leadership development, but it's really like in part recognizing leadership and honoring it and supporting it. as well as then building and developing it and seeing it in future people, was just like built into the culture of the organization. So Kali at the time was taking these 4 buildings that had been abandoned by their owners but occupied by their tenants and making them into a mutual housing association. And so one of the kind of the tenants in those buildings, Barbara Bethel, rest in peace, was like the first person hired on that Vista grant we got. You know, and I think in some other places, the Vista grants, you know, were like kids from, and I mean, they had hired me as executive director, sort of thinking, all right, yeah, like it looks like you could kind of fill out the grant applications and like do the work to keep the housing development moving forward. But the leadership development opportunities are, you know, going to the people who are been fighting and saving these buildings in this neighborhood. And that balance really did both work in the organization and get kind of built into the culture to keep doing. And yeah, we don't have that many places where we're good at recognizing, you know, leadership as so many different things.
Let me throw it open to the room for questions. I'm not seeing a ton of questions in the Q&A in the Zoom, but let me throw it open in the room and see what else comes in.
I just want to say.
Oh, yeah.
We continue to have, like, the Vista pipeline, the CETA Vista pipeline still exists.
Yeah.
Oh, great.
Right? I mean, we have folks in this room that started as AmeriCorps Vistas. We have many folks, that's how they started in this organization and then, you know, go on to stay or other things. So it's an important, like, ladder. I think.
Oh, and you can see it in so much of the work, you know, it's just not that long ago, whatever, at the BWI annual event every year. And like what that often honors is somebody who is a person who got their chance through BWI and then
Right.
pulls lots of other people into their employer behind them. And just like that spirit of a thing that, yes, like offers services to people, like you get job training so you can move, but it's that culture of that leadership is this kind of shared activity. Yeah, you see in whatever the organizing on all the organizing, but the organizing on the rezoning. I don't think people really understand that with so many rezoning fights, you know, that like they just kind of all play out the same. You really had to like sit in the room and see how real the organizing was to understand, you know, like that's a set of people who whose deep knowledge about what's needed to make the neighborhood succeed is what's being built on, and the organization's training and empowering them in what the heck a rezoning is to make that leadership effective. And that in a certain way, that was something new, and in another way, it's just like a set of principles that got built into the DNA of the organization that like everyone talks about, you know, like not everyone believes in that. No one would say those things aren't important, but they're hard to really do. Organizational life often pulls you away from that work and what it is that has kind of set back up, you know, as kind of Pat and Fran and others kind of built it in that spirit and enabled it across all this growth to still have so much of that in it is pretty special.
Yeah.
Yes.
Pat and Wendy both talked about the kind of constitutional diverse neighborhood that existed here with, you know, the comptroller said is really just that you're not because of your efforts, just capitalism. But I'm curious for a lot of the work that happens, particularly in the development space today, you don't see diverse movements, particularly in favor of more housing. And I am wondering from your experience, like, how do we make that type of movement, how do we support that at Back and Beyond emerge in our kind of future development sites?
I don't know. The one thing that I would say is that I think it's important to make sure that we continue to support the idea that having diverse voices included as part of the planning process and policy making is important. That's an important place to start. If no matter how well intentioned, if everyone in the room has the same background and history, you're not gonna end up with the kind of broad picture of, in your imagination, in your vision of what could happen. And so I think, organizing, for that reason, that organizing is a critical part of doing development. That you have to organize to bring in people, and give them the support so they feel like, okay, it's worth coming to this meeting. You know, I'm not just, gonna be sitting in a corner somewhere, and maybe given one opportunity to speak, and then, that's the end of my involvement. I think we have to figure out ways to involve people truly in the planning, and visioning of what could be.
Just building on that, can you all point to like promising examples where you do see that kind of cross-racial, cross-cultural, cross-class engagement on planning issues? Or, I mean, where are there kind of like great
Did it here.
examples? Yeah, so I want to invite you to, talk about that and.
Sit here in Gowanus, right? The Gowanus Neighborhood Coalition for Justice is a multiracial, multi-sector coalition that came together to fight for an inclusive Gowanus neighborhood-wide rezoning, right? And
As a matter of policy, built the organizing work in coalition and then said, there needs to be a law that requires a racial equity analysis of this and every other rezoning to figure out whether it's heading the city in a more equitable and inclusive direction or not. I actually just had coffee with Councilmember Natasha Williams, who leads the Civil Rights Committee, and she's like, we need to do a hearing on that law and see what's working and what's not working. And yeah, I think outside of this one, I don't know, but yeah.
I think it's a great question, and I think the coalition is more diverse than maybe people realize. I think, at certain hearings, certain folks show up and maybe others less so, but the Right to the City Coalition is very diverse. Obviously, the Housing Justice for All Coalition is very diverse. I think that we have to figure out how to bring the housing movements and the tenant movements more together and more aligned. That's I think the work that needs to happen in the next year in particular would be great. There are literally hundreds of thousands of people seeking affordable housing in this city. Like, we know it because they're applying through our lotteries. We need to organize those folks. That's who we need to work.
One other thing I would add here is that I really do think a rebooted commitment to shared equity models is actually pretty important here. Wendy mentioned that was like one of the first development that FACT did, and has been some of the work along the way. It's so hard to do, especially if you're like bootstrapping the programs to do it. But the difference between value that's created through density, feeling like it belongs to people, and value created through density, belonging developers to rent it to you at a price that somebody regulated, is pretty profound. And that was a real central element of early community development, and it is mostly gone. There are some people doing good land trust organizing, but it's mostly, especially it's bizarre here because, if you look at all of the Mitchell Llamas, like New York City created a ton of it and then stopped. Like, the pivot was so fast, that happened when it was perceived that land really didn't have market value. And so letting communities have it was just like, well, no one cares. And things shifted so quickly. And that seemed good in a certain way, right? The fact that, neighborhoods that have been written off were being revitalized through this, but it just, there was a time when basically, like, of the city's vacant stock, a third went to nonprofits, a third to for-profits, and a third to tenants themselves. And now it's over 80% goes to for-profit private developers to build rental housing. And, the challenge is we need a lot more affordable rental housing. And the easiest thing to do is just like hope that system keeps producing it. But if we want people to see development or density or growth as as theirs, which ultimately is the only way they could durably be enthusiastic about it. You'd have to have some more of it that was. And like I, you know, having spent a lot of time fighting NIMBYism in the name of fair housing, there's a little bit of me that's like glad there's a recognition that we need more housing. But the idea that like, you know, that either that will be durable or that like that's what people want, or just have to like take their medicine of, as opposed to what does it look like to make growth something that builds inclusive community, which is hard across income levels and across races. Like we have lost a lot of, and yeah, so that's, I mean, that's where certainly one place where I think we have work that can be successful. People are hungry for that. I sometimes do like a poll in a room I'm in, especially if it's like kind of working class families, which is like how many people feel we have an affordable housing crisis, and you're worried your kids will not be able to afford a place to live. And everyone raises their hand. I'm like, okay, so now, you know, we hear that what we need is like more housing to solve that problem. So, okay, how many of you are excited about new tall housing development, you know, by developers in your neighborhood? And no one raises their hands. And then if you tease out what a, you know, next generation of Mitchell Lama or, you know, limited equity co-ops might look like, you know, and then you say, okay, well, how about that? Even if it's bigger than your row houses, like half the people. So like we
So,
could.
like, just a follow up. I think we all are still operating under the like framework that having equity through home ownership, not in a limited equity model, but just home ownership as a way of building wealth is the path. And like, that's not how the wealthy people are even wealthy in this country anymore. Yet the rest of the country that hasn't had that is still aiming for that. So when I think about being an organization like this, or any community development organization that's trying to create racial justice opportunities, I wonder like where we should be pivoting people. And I know Michelle and I have had this conversation. But I'm a newcomer to the FACT family, so I think I'm still trying to understand where else wealth can be built, especially in a city where home ownership isn't going to be the path for most people.
So I just want to mention we're coming to time. So I think some of this may happen, some of this conversation may continue after we close out our Zoom. But I think it's an awesome set of questions to grapple with.
I think we have 2 questions online, right?
Oh, we have questions online.
While you're looking online, I'll just say this, that it's all about having clarity about what you want to do. Like, and what is your intention? What is the problem you're trying to solve for? Is the problem you're trying to solve for inequality? Is it housing stability? Is it, you know, addressing the racial wealth gap? Like, depending on how you answer these questions, there are different programs and different projects and ways of financing things that like address those things. And all of that has to be informed by the values. All of that has to be informed by the values, but you gotta have real clarity on that.
So the 2 questions are both asking the same question, which is also the question I end with, which is, what about the next 45 years? Or I might say it as, what is a hope or a wish for Fifth Avenue Committee and its work for the next 45 years? And Pat, we'll start with you, and maybe we will go in chronological order this time.
Well, I hope that the organization continues to be able to hold on to the values that we've been talking about. And I think if we do that, the future will make itself. I have no idea what it will be like. I couldn't have guessed 45 years ago that we would be where we are now. And so another 45 years, I'm looking at you all from somewhere else.
Wendy?
Yeah, I mean, I would just reflect that at that time, 45 years ago, we also couldn't envision what New York City would look like right now. The level of population, the level of wealth, the level of wealth disparity, and the amount of gentrification and displacement that had happened. Like it wasn't in our wildest imagination to think that that could happen. back in the early 80s. And New York will keep changing. I mean, no one imagined a pandemic or vacant commercial space on Park Avenue. Like, there's so many things that will keep evolving that we can't still imagine. But I totally trust that Fifth Avenue Committee will, it's just in the fabric of the organization, the sense of community is first. And the people who we care about are the people who so many other people don't seem to care about. And we will bring that forward into our work, whatever that work evolves into. And I just totally trust and believe that.
Brad, a hope or a wish?
Yeah, well, it seems pretty clear to me that for New York City as a whole to thrive, given the challenges it is facing and is likely to face in the next 45 years, like it is the values and the kind of work that has done that like make that possible. You see like, we're fighting now about this set of people walking across a continent to get here. And a set of people sure that like that's a problem or, will destroy our city. And like the only way the city has like a chance of a future is if it can lean into its inclusive self. That is hard. There's all kinds of reasons why it's challenging to do that. And it's hard work. And it's like the kind of work this organization does. So like, and we're going to see more immigration. The climate crisis is going to drive it. Challenges related to climate are going to call for more shared community action. And those places that can do it will be places people are thriving and succeeding. And those places where it's weaker will be places where people are pissed off at each other. And so, I think it's, like, I think there's every reason to believe that the things that make New York what it can be, like a inclusive, multiracial social democracy that fights to include people across all these really hard lines of race and class and wealth. Like it'll be exciting to see what new projects come along to make that possible. And yeah, it's not that valuable, I think, to say, well, here's what that, new 21st century, Mitchell Lama will look like, or here's what the next generation climate project will look like. They'll get built by staff that aren't even here today. But I think the idea that if it succeeds, it's actually going to be grounded pretty much in the same values the organization has been building and renewing over these 45 years is pretty clear.
Michelle, the last word.
I'll just say ditto. And I think you have to think about like how work is going to change. And I mean, our relationship to work has evolved just in the last few years so significantly, but like the technological advances that are coming that like threaten, millions of jobs, and like, what does that mean? At the same time that we have a digital divide that is really significant and a real huge gap, like those are very, very real. I think, part of what FACT needs to continue to do is think several steps ahead about what are all the changes that are happening, like, the broad ones that are happening globally and how they play out locally. And then how do we help ensure that as that change happens, that equity is at the center, that justice is at the center, that fairness is at the center, that inclusion is at the center. Like that to me is like what we have to continue to do. And hopefully as we do it, more of the values about that will make our city more inclusive and more fair will actually get institutionalized as laws and as obligations that government has to address inequality, so that quite honestly we can do less and society can be more balanced and everybody can thrive.
Please thank me in joining our panel. Thanks to those of you on Zoom, and for folks here, I believe we have some snacks and vittles and.
Yeah.
So stick around.
Thank you, Sam.